I went there during a busy time because I was like, you know what? There's going to be hundreds of people walking by constantly. I'm about to ask people for money. And so I said, okay, I got to do this, got to try it out. Even though that's something that also makes me uncomfortable, the idea of asking for something. But it's like, I was at least telling people what I was getting. And there's a target right there where the tarps are. So I was literally asking people, saying like, you know, I'm trying to raise $24 because I have to buy 2 tarps for my tent. I'm currently living on Skid Row and I need help getting my tarps for the rain. I had seen over 600 people that day. And everyone said no to me. Everyone. Like, to the point where I don't sit in like fury often and long because I don't like that energy. I was furious that day. I was so angry by the level of resilience to help. No one wanted to help me. Like, the energy that went into the no's and the not help could have easily solved my problem.
Hey there, and welcome back to At the End of the Tunnel. In this episode, we're having a very special conversation with someone who I consider to be an angel in human form, known as LaRayia Gaston. So when I go to a new city, one of the first things I like to do is visit a local coffee shop or perhaps go to the park, and that's just my thing. But when LaRayia goes to a new city, the first thing she likes to do is to visit the homeless area. She wants to see where the Skid Row of that city is, and that's because her life's work has been about helping to improve the lives of homeless people wherever she is. So in this very special interview, LaRayia is going to be sharing her story of how she was first introduced to that type of work and what inspired her to live on Skid Row in Los Angeles for a period of time, and all of the lessons that she's learned from dedicating herself to helping the homeless since she was a teenager. There's so much more to say about LaRayia, but I want you to have the pleasure of hearing about her life's work through this conversation. I think you're really going to love this one and be so inspired by the end. You'll laugh. You may even shed a tear or two. And by the end of the episode, my guess is that you'll never see homeless people in the same way again. So without further ado, let's get right to the conversation with Miss LaRayia Gaston. So LaRayia, thank you very much for joining the podcast. As always, I want to start off in childhood talking about little LaRayia. And so my question for you is, when you think back to your earliest memories in childhood, what would you say was your favorite toy or activity back in those days?
Growing up, I would say I loved drawing and painting.
What did you love about drawing and painting?
I love the idea of creating places I haven't been. I felt very confined as a child, so I feel like between art and books, those are the place I got to travel. And so it was always creating something better. I feel like I've always tried to create a space that didn't necessarily look like my own. Growing up, I think a lot of people draw their environments. I always drew something better than what I experienced. I feel like I've always tried to fine tune anything that was. You know, even when I would draw things, I would, if I had to draw something in front of me, I'm like, yeah, well, this flower's dying a little bit, so I'm going to draw it at its full potential. So like, I was like one of those, like I would find things to draw, but I always notice I would change things. I would always make them better. So drawing and books, I started reading biographies by like 3rd grade.
Was that a conscious thing when you were drawing and making things better? Did you know that that's what you were doing, or did someone kind of point that out to you one day?
I think that I started to realize that just in life. I think that every time I would draw something, it was more of a perfect version of it. And I think that's something that, like, over time, I didn't know at the time. I think it was very just innate and natural to me. I always looked at things like that, like I wouldn't draw things that I didn't like to show what was dying. I always liked to show what was living. And I had to draw a lot of like subjects, especially in art. I've been in art my whole life, where you're always given a subject, something to a point of reference. And I think I'd always naturally made it better. And then even with books, I felt like it was kind of the same thing. I gravitated towards biographies of people that I thought were great at a very young age.
What were some of the biographies that still stand out?
The first biography I ever read was Duke Ellington. I was in third grade, and I always loved jazz music. I've always loved the 50s. I had a very, very strong connection to it. And so for me, reading about Duke Ellington and his life and Miles Davis, those things changed so much in my perspective of life, especially great African Americans. My father he's very, very adamant about me recognizing and seeing people that are great that look like me. He was very cognizant at a young age to show me representation, that I could do anything and that were people that looked like me were successful. So I think that's kind of what I gravitated towards. It was always Black American history and great, great people. You know, I remember my father giving me like Frederick Douglass when I was like in fifth grade. I was a child. And he's like, you want to learn about a man who freed himself. So I think I always had been in a space where I was always introduced to real life circumstances, but I'd always been introduced to people who rose above them.
Do you remember any of the lessons that you learned from the Duke Ellington or Miles Davis biographies?
Oh, I think the biggest thing was being so young, hearing about racism and prejudice and things like that, and recognizing people who just wanted to express themselves in art, where at the time was very different than now in a certain degree, because at that time it was very obvious things that they went through, like segregation. So I just remember seeing things that people were faced that they couldn't help, but still being resilient enough to pursue whatever it was they loved. So I remember like third grade, learning about the Cotton Club and learning about how people would have to go through different entrances, you know, things like that, just to be able to share their art, to share their gifts. And I think subconsciously I'd always had in the back of my mind that people were willing to fight fire just to be heard, to be seen, to be understood. And I understood that very young. I mean, I remember like the first entertainers I ever read about were Lena Horne and Eartha Kitt, you know, women who took a stance. So even in their art, what I loved is there was always leadership, there was always progression, and there was always an advocacy for people through all of their arts. So I learned very young that art didn't have to just be an expression. It could influence people.
Right. It was a form of activism.
And that's what I loved. Like, I'm like, wow, like, you know, Lena Horne wouldn't take roles being a slave. She wouldn't take roles that didn't give her the dignity she felt she deserved, you know? So just to see people that were willing to take a stand for how they saw themselves, not how the world decided they would be, I understood that very young. I just thought that was like the coolest thing ever. I really, really gravitated towards it and admired that.
Talk a little bit about the cultural background of your mother and father and where you grew up.
I was raised by my stepfather. My birth mom is Greek, Creole, and Irish. And that's my biological mother. And my biological father is Puerto Rican and Cuban. And then I was raised with my stepfather, who's Black and Italian. He's Sicilian. And so growing up, I have 3 different sides of the family and everyone's different cultures. So I grew up in a space that I grew up where I had seen every form of culture. For us, like our Black culture was our Creole family, which came from Louisiana. So learning that part of it, learning Afro-Latinos being from grandparents who were immigrants that came from Puerto Rico and Cuba. And then just having all of my parents being mixed in a time where it wasn't necessarily accepted. So all of them had 2 sides of the family. So you're dealing with 6 different sides of the family. So I think it was really amazing that I grew up with that and grew up with family in different social and economic standings, because I learned what rich looked like. I learned what poor looked like. I learned what culture looked like in America. And I think it definitely helped form my idea of people very young, because I was around so many different type of people. I feel like I didn't live necessarily a segregated life where I was just with one family, one upbringing. I didn't live in a bubble. And then my parents were extremely young. My mother had me at 19 years old. So on top of that, you know, you have a baby raising a baby. And so definitely not a woman yet, right? Like you don't know yourself fully in that age. So I feel like there were so many different moments. And then I gravitated towards my My grandmother was more of my maternal figure. So also having a woman who was born in the 30s, I got to learn what it was like to fight for interracial relationships. My grandfather was Black. My grandmother is Irish and Greek. So having these spaces, I felt like I grew up with such a vast, wide understanding of life and people and how we come in so many different ways and different walks. I learned that very young. And then I also learned the perception of who I would be in life. I would be a Black woman in this world, no matter how expanded my mind was, no matter how many things I understood. I knew, even though the world confined me in one small space, just based off the stereotypes, I knew I had so much more, but I knew how small-minded the world was as well.
How did you learn that? Was it through the biographies, or someone kind of sat you down and taught you that?
I learned that through being young and people talking about culture and race. I mean, elementary school. You know, I remember kids asking me, well, what are you? Are you Black? Are you Spanish? You look a little white. Like, I would hear those things as a kid, where I was always the question, wait, but what are you? And for me, because I grew up with such strong Black leaders, I grew up looking at my parents as their influence predominantly being Black. Like, that overshadowed everything. They proudly wrote Black in all the things that they did. They didn't feel like they were half and half. They felt like they navigated from their Black, their African ancestry. So growing up, I felt so much pride in that, right? So I was always like, yeah, I'm a Black woman, you know, like that was important to me. Like, I'm African American. And they're like, but your grandparents speak Spanish, like all these different things. I learned very young that I was answering questions that came from narrow minds. I learned that about the world just by being in my family, learning where I always thought all of us had melanin. And I know we came from Africa somehow, some way, in different ways. So people would say to me, I could see there was just always this confusion where you couldn't be all things, right? Where it was always narrow-minded. For me, I found so much pride in being African American because of what the influence in this country has been, what Black people have had to endure and overcome, and the influence. There is no culture in America outside of Black culture. It is assimilated and used as culture for all of America. And so I had so much pride. Like, I had so much pride, like knowing Eartha Kitt and Lena Horne, they're like me, and they were Black women. Like, having that connection to me was just, I felt like it was a badge of honor, you know, because I found the beauty in it. So it was very interesting growing up and being questioned about my culture or my identity, or, you know, I wasn't Black enough because my skin wasn't dark brown, or like just hearing the things that you just didn't really understand. Or like, how is your grandma blonde hair, blue eyes, and white? You know what I mean? Like, there were all these questions that you could tell people were so confused with that level of unity, that level of diversity.
Sounds like you enjoyed it a little bit. You enjoyed it as an opportunity to kind of expose people to these new ways of.
Yes, because I felt like it was so cool to go to different sides of your family and know, oh, if we're going over here, we're having Italian food. If we're going over there, we're having Puerto Rican food. Oh, I'm having Cajun food with my Creole family. Like, I felt like it was such a representation of all of my family coming to America to meet, because my grandparents are immigrants. So we only have 2 generations, you know, just from my family, where to me, that was the representation where America showed so many different types of people. How did all my family end up here together? You know? So I love that idea, because I got to see the differences and the similarities because I was on both sides. I got to go to different churches, you know? It's like my Italian family, they're Presbyterian. My Creole family, they're Baptist, they're Methodist. Like, I grew up in different churches too.
And you grew up where? In New York?
Yes. And my mother went there very young, and then my grandmother lived in Arizona. So I would spend a lot of time in Arizona, like in the summer and stuff, until I moved there as a young kid. But yeah. And then my father's from Philly. So my stepdad that I was raised with, he's from Philly. So I spent a lot of time in Philly as well.
Did you learn Spanish or Italian?
Not Italian, Spanish. Yes. My grandfather, that's their first language. So my Spanish, it's broken, but it's good. Like, I can speak Spanish. It is. It's not my first language. It's definitely my second. But yes, I grew up where I 100% understand it because, I mean, it was part of our language, like we had to know it.
And what lessons do you remember taking when you were attending all that church, Baptist and Presbyterian church growing up?
You know what? For me, it was like I grew up in the church, but I didn't find God there. So it was a very interesting space. I was really close to my grandmother. So being in a Baptist church, that was my favorite. When I would be in Presbyterian church, I'm like half the time they're speaking Latin. What is going on? I'm going downstairs for donuts. I didn't really understand fully that. I didn't grasp that experience as much. But my grandmother being Baptist and that being my best friend, we got different parts of it. Like I definitely would view her and how she's seen church, and she got something out of it that I didn't necessarily get. Because church for me was my community, people. And so at first when a lot of it didn't resonate with me because I didn't have a full grasp on it, because I felt like every church I went to, every church's message was they were the one and only message of God. And so it was very hard for me because I went to different churches all the time with different religious backgrounds, and they were all saying that same thing. Their stories were so similar, but they created such separation. So I think it was hard for me to experience God in it because I had seen so much separation that seemed the opposite of the God I understood.
I've heard you talk about tithing. Is that something you got from church?
Yeah, I feel like that is probably the number one thing. Like, I feel like if I read the Bible, my favorite sentence, it was about tithing because I learned that everything I have was not mine to keep. So I think that it gave me this idea that in order to live, we have to distribute and give to one another. And I learned that we're tithing, for people who might not know, it's when you give away 10% of what you have. And it's religiously, faithfully, like that's something where you do not feel everything is yours. And for me, I used to tithe heavily in church because that's what my grandmother did. That's what my family did. And then I started tithing within the community. But that is like the number one thing, is my favorite thing. And even in my spiritual practices and everything else, it always goes back to tithing because tithing is powerful to me.
You would get an allowance and you would give 10% of your allowance.
Yeah,
in church.
I would. Since I was a child, I'm talking about young, little, I was always told you have to put 10% away. My grandmother was adamant about that. And obviously it was like 10% is the least you can give. That wasn't a max. That was the least. I definitely give more than that. I probably tithe. I would say I tithe about 30% of my income, maybe 40.
And you had an understanding as a child that was something that was valuable to do. It wasn't like a punishment or anything like that. It was
a joy. Like my grandmother always, I would watch her write out a check and she would be smiling, like just to be able to give. It was definitely a joy for her. She made it where it was like, this is how we help each other. This is how we support each other. And you could see it in her. There was never a pressure or thought. She would give, and it was so much. She would do it, and it was so innate to her that I don't even think she'd remember half the time she'd give.
How many siblings did you have?
I'm the oldest of 8.
And did everybody have that relationship with church and tithing, or were you kind of the leader of the pack?
Yeah, it was different for me because my siblings, the next child my mom had is 9 years from me. So it's such a big age gap. I have a sister that's 13. Wow. It was such a big age gap because my mom was 19 when she had me. So she, was like, let me wait till my 30s to have my next kid. So no, my relationship and experience with my parents was very different. It's like, it's having a 19-year-old parent and having a 30-year-old parent is very different. And so I feel like we definitely grew up differently. For me, my grandmother was my mom. That's who, I ran to her. And so that relationship, even in church, even when my siblings were very young, it would be me and my grandmother. I would go with her. It'd be her and I. I felt like a very personal relationship, her and I. They went to church as they got a little older, but it was a huge difference. But when they started going to church, I was already out of church on the streets helping people.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a context for heaven and hell and those kinds of ideas? And how did you feel about that when you were younger?
Well, a lot of things for me, I think that from my experience and from biblical terms and coming from a very literal place, right? Like you're hearing about the Bible, you're young. I'm just like, wow, like certain things I'm like, why is heaven paved with gold? I don't see the value of that. Like I would always question certain things. Certain things didn't make sense to me. I mean, you read about even the Old Testament, God being of wrath and a jealous God. That wasn't who I pray to. That's not what I connect to when I go to my highest space. So it was very confusing because and thank God I had a grandmother who would let me ask all these questions because I'm like, I don't fear God. I feel comfort there. You know, like why would I fear the place I feel most comfort? So I would always say, are we praying to the same God? And my grandmother, very young, she knew that I always had my own thoughts, my own ideas, and I wasn't afraid. There was no fear based in me to feel like it had to be this way. I just always wanted to get it right, whatever right was.
Yeah, one of the elements that ends up coming up in people's stories are these figures that come into their lives. I call them angels. I refer to them as angels, not in a religious sense, but just in a sort of higher guidance sense, where these people are there to kind of point you in a direction, or like you say, answer questions that you may have, and to give you context for what you may not realize is going to be your purpose in life later on. Your grandmother, it sounds like she was one of them. And then I've done some research before this interview, and I read about this girl named Jamila, which to me sounded like she's also one of your angels. And you had a really interesting story of meeting her when you were 8 years old. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Jamila is my best friend. It's so funny. I talk to her every day. I talked to her before I got on the phone with you. My best friend was my grandmother, my Philly grandmother, my stepfather's mother's neighbor. She lived like 4 houses down. And she's very psychic, even beyond what she'd ever admit. She's just it's just like one of those things she embodies it that she doesn't even say it's that. She just knows, and it's a matter of fact, and that's it. Like she doesn't even put it in a category, but she's so psychic. She's so connected like to past life regression. And long story short, it was a weekend where we switched where we were both in Philly. We would usually go opposite. She would go to New York on the weekends and I would go to Philly on the weekends. And then one weekend we were, there's a fire hydrant in the neighborhood that's on the corner, house where my grandmother is. And I'm of course playing in the fire hydrant, like, because I was like one of those loner kids. I'm the first child, the only child for about 10 years. And long story short, she was claiming her block. We were kids and she was claiming the block, telling me where did I come from and that this was their fire hydrant. And I was like, my grandmother lives right there. Long story short, we end up getting into it because my best friend is trying to claim a fire hydrant and we're children, like we're babies. And long story short, my grandmother comes out and is like, Jamila, yelling her name. And I'm like, you know this girl? Because she's giving me trouble. She's stirring trouble with me. And she's like, you guys are both in timeout. And we had to go to my grandmother's yard. And I'm like upset because I'm like, I was playing by myself. She came over to start trouble.
Minding your own business.
Minding my own business. Now I can't play at the fire hydrant. For anyone that didn't grow up on the East Coast, our fire hydrants are like our pools. A fire department will come, open one, and you play in it like it's raining. It's really fun. But we're sitting there and I'll just never forget the day because we're children. And she looks at me and she says, after we were in timeout, and she was just mean to me. She goes, you're my best friend. And I'm like, what? She's like, you're going to be my best friend for life. And she says to me, she's like, God knew no one woman could handle us as sisters, but he knew to give me my best friend. And she just tells me that. And I'm just like, what? Like I'm very, it's over my head. It's deeper than I even understood at that time. Cause I'm like, you just told me I'm your best friend for life. I'm pretty much like your twin sister, like our family call us, our nickname and the family is Salt and Pepper. And so everyone like in the family, like we're like been best friends since we were children. To this day, we're sisters. I mean, there's no one I could even imagine closer to me. She's an anchor in my life. But it was one of those moments where she told me very, very, that I would be her best friend. And I swear to God, I've never had a better friend.
Is it true that you told your grandmother that when you left the house that day that you were going to come back with your best friend?
Yeah. I knew it. I felt it. I felt it because I never really had friends before that. I was into books. I played by myself. When she found me, I played by myself, but I knew it. I felt it in my spirit, but it was weird because I didn't think that's how the best friend would come. Like it wasn't how I played it out in my head. I thought it was going to be a little more
We're going to
harmonious
have
than
beef
that.
at the fire hydrant. And then
Yes.
I'll be
We're
in
going to be in
timeout.
timeout.
And then it'll be revealed to me.
And I knew it. I knew I had a best friend coming. I was so little, but it was the first time I didn't know she was my best friend. She knew it. I knew she was coming. I didn't know who she was. Cause I've always like had a sixth sense for like things that would happen before they happen. And yeah, I knew it. And she was my first friend and she's still my best friend I've ever had.
So it sounds like you had a pretty good childhood.
I made the best of it. There were parts that were great. There were parts that were horrific, but I made the best of everything. But it wasn't an easy childhood. I feel like if when people describe their childhood, I think that mine was a lot more challenging than most children. I grew up very fast and it was a difficult time.
You worked at your uncle's restaurant as a teenager?
Yeah, 12. Well, I was way too young to be working.
Were you working out of necessity or you just had a drive to want to work?
It was a little bit of both because my parents didn't have a lot in that way to give. And I think that I always knew, like, I never liked to really ask for things just because I knew, like, especially with my dad, not so much my birth mom because I wasn't really close to her. We've had a very difficult relationship my whole life. But my stepdad, which is like my best friend in the whole entire world, I mean, he just worked really hard and did so much for my family that I felt like if I wanted things, I should just work for them. I didn't like to ask. It made me very uncomfortable, but that was my second job. My second job was my uncle's at 12. I had a job before then when I was cleaning real estate offices in the middle of the night from like midnight to 5 a.m.
Wow.
And I was 12. So I had a cleaning job before. And then my uncle decided to have this Creole barbecue business and I was his first employee and I was young and I was working, 12, 14 hours on the weekends.
And you had an experience there at the dumpster.
Yeah, that was the first time I encountered an angel. Basically, my uncle would leave me there at like midnight, 2 a.m. to clean up. Basically, I had to do all the grunt work. He didn't have the best morals sometimes, but now that I think about it being my age, but one day I was packing everything up, cleaning up, getting rid of food. Like we'd have to throw away food that same day that wasn't sold, like perfectly good food. And one day I was gathering all the food and a man was digging in a trash can. I always say that this was my first encounter with an angel. I've had angels in my life, but this was the first time I was like, okay, this is something supernatural where it was the first time I felt in my mind the stories of the Bible are 100% true, because it was a situation where I offered this man food. He didn't speak. He wasn't speaking. He was kind of like signing, doing these like very interesting movements. Like he was dancing. It was just very like, it was just mystical. It was very ethereal. And I felt a comfort in his energy. Like I just remember being like, this guy should be weird to me, but I don't feel that way. Like I just remember.
Was this in the middle of the night or was this in the day?
Oh
daytime?
yeah. This was probably like midnight, 1 a.m. And I'm there by myself. And I offered this man food. He had a little grocery cart because he was looking at the trash can. He wanted the food. And it was interesting because everything, like the movement he was making, it was almost like he was like celebrating me. Like it was really weird. Like I can't even explain it. Like he was grabbing his heart. He was doing all these weird gestures. But I understood them. Like I was like, he's treating me like I'm great. This is weird. Like I was like, this guy's being weird because he was treating me like I was royalty. I was wonderful. It was interesting. So I gave him the food. I forgot to give him a drink. I turn around to grab a drink and say like, hey, I forgot to give you a drink. I turn back around. The man is completely gone, disappeared. The food is still in the basket. The cart is left there and he's nowhere to be found. And there was nowhere for him to go. And that day it shook me to the point where I was so young. I thought I was crazy, but then I was like, I can't really share this with anyone because I'm not even supposed to be talking to strangers. Like, I was just like, I can't really tell anyone, but I'm like, this man just disappeared. And I always say that, like, it makes people feel so uncomfortable. I'm like, no. I turned around and this man was gone. And the interesting part was, fast forward maybe 3-4 years later, my last day working, I saw him with the grocery cart walking by across the street, waving his hand. And I'll never forget that because the whole time I was like, I always thought, did I make this up? Did I see this? Like, was this real? Because I questioned myself. And years later, he was walking by with the same kind of grocery cart and waved at me. Never stopped, nothing. And it was weird because I still didn't know at that time. I didn't know that that would be my path, like, but I knew that that was like the defining moment where I was definitely faced with a huge part of my destiny.
What did you think your path would be? Did you think it was going to be artistic, or what were you thinking when you were that age?
Yeah, that's all I knew. It was like art. I danced professionally. So it was like, I just thought I would always be an artist and dance. I really thought that that was it. I didn't think far about it. I think people would always tell me, oh, I would do great things. But I'm like, okay, yeah, I just want to create. So to me, it's like, if I can escape and go into art, that's all I cared about. I didn't think of anything. Obviously, like, I was really good in school. I had an opportunity to go to college, but I decided not to go. I chose not to go because I just felt like I just wanted to create. I was like, I don't want to be in another school. And I was good at science. Like, the only other thing I said that if I went to school, I was going to go to school for chemistry to do cosmetic development. But it's only because I wanted to create makeup for women of color. Because at the time, there wasn't that in art. There wasn't that, even when you would go dance and stuff, you're like, oh my God, there's so many colors that it's just like lacking. So that was the only other thing I knew. I always loved science. That was always fun to me. But art was like my heart. That was like number one. It was more like science was interesting and I was naturally good at it. But I'm like, I don't want to be in a lab for the rest of my life. I want to be out in the world. And so I just made this weird impulsive decision to be like, no, I'm just going to pursue art. I'm going to be creative in any medium that there is. As long as my mind can be challenged and I can solve problems and I can create and make tangible things, I didn't care what part of art it was.
Mm-hmm. And what did you do differently after that encounter with the homeless man and the food?
I started, every time I saw someone homeless, I would offer them food. And then I loved doing it. I just met such nice people. And then eventually I asked my grandmother if I could not tithe in church and tithe by buying people food. And that's how it started. Because I was really scared because I thought that tithing just needed to be in the church, because that's where I learned it. And my grandmother was like, I don't care what you do as long as you do your part.
And your uncle was okay with you using his food that he was throwing away?
He was not. So my uncle represented the most business. It was very interesting because I feel like I had learned the things I would encounter as I would actually pursue this in my life. Because my uncle was like, no, it's a liability. I can get sued. I can get shut down. You cannot give away free food. So I started tithing. That's how the change happened, because I would be giving food away. But I didn't ask because it was food it was perfectly good food that had to go in the trash. And it was one of those situations where that same food I was giving away was food that I was taking home as leftovers, So it was completely fine. It's just I couldn't eat all of it. The amount of food that gets wasted, no one person could eat. And my uncle represented the corporations I fought. I have fought for a very long time because everyone, it was money and profit over people. And so I always had to fight that narrative, but it started with my uncle. And at the time I was just like, it's okay, because I'm going to figure something else out. And then that's when I started tithing. My money from what I was using in church, I asked if I could just go buy people food if I could. And that's what I would do. I would buy people food. I would give them $20 and be like, here, go get something. Or, but I always kept my tiny money in my wallet. I always had money so that if I didn't have time to sit with someone and eat with them or order their food with me, if I was on the go, I could make sure that they could eat.
And where are you at this point? Because I know you eventually relocated to Arizona.
Yeah. So at that time, I was in Arizona for like 3 years. And then
Yeah.
I went to Mexico for work. It was like one of my
Right.
first jobs as a dancer because, like, again, I was dancing during this time. And I was dancing. And then from there, I went back to New York. And then I came to LA. I'd been going back and forth to LA since I was like 21.
You were dancing for Pitbull.
Yes.
And which is a pretty high profile gig, which means you must have been putting a lot of focused energy into your dancing.
No, it was one of those things that, well, no, I love doing it, but it was one of those things, sometimes when you're naturally good at certain things, you don't have to put the same energy as someone that isn't. It was just like a natural gift. Mm-hmm. So it was like something I just literally enjoyed doing. But I stopped because, the reason I kind of transitioned and I started doing music videos was because I remember we were doing a video for Chris Brown and mm-hmm. I was like, wait a minute, the girls who are just the pretty models get paid the same as us and we're sweating and dying. I'm about to do some videos. Literally, I did videos. Because I was like, I'm tired. Like, I just remember he wore us out. I remember it was like 40 hours in 2 days of nonstop mm-hmm. filming. And I was exhausted. My best friend was there. And I was like, and I love it. Like, Chris Brown is a very hard worker in dancing. But I was like, I'm about to start doing videos. And so like I started auditioning because it was like, it worked because I could model in videos and every time they needed a dancer, they could throw me in to dance, So that would happen to me a lot. I would get hired and they're like, we need one more person to learn this choreography. We're a person short. So it just gave me the space where it was like I could dance and I didn't have to break my neck every time and I could do videos as well. So I started doing that too. And so I did, tons of music videos. And that was just kind of like, but it was something that I didn't really love the industry. I liked dancing, but I didn't like the industries. I didn't like the politics of it. It was a little weird for me because I was just like a little dirty art kid, just like to create. So it was like, there were like extra elements that didn't resonate with my spirit. So I kind of like slowly, unfortunately, kind of was like, I don't know if I want to do this because the industry part did not resonate with my spirit. So I was like, so I started designing clothes because I would always like customize my own clothes, make things. And so I also started a clothing brand because I was like, maybe I'll have a little more control over like the things I do. And I don't have to feel like I'm in the industry. I could do like really fun stuff. So I was always trying to find that medium and that space where I could just be an artist.
So I'm curious, in that entertainment industry world, you're like 17, 18 years old. All right. You're out of the States for part of it. You're hanging out with these high profile people. What's your mental state at that point? Because a lot of younger people, and especially younger women, they get to be a bit anxious and they have, panic attacks and all this kind of stuff, depression, maybe even. What was your mental state like?
I think I was very strong conditioned because I had such a rough childhood in certain moments. Mm-hmm. For me, you know what? I saw a lot of drugs and substance abuse, and I've never even tried weed before. Like I have lived an extreme sober life because I always tell people I was exposed to drugs when they weren't cute. I've been to crack houses. I have had family members who are drug addicts. I've experienced some really hard things with drugs, not from me and my use, but what it's done to families and what it's done to my own family and the experiences mm-hmm. I've had where I just wanted no parts of that. I just wanted to do art. So it was one of those things that to me, it was like, no one understood. It was like, I didn't understand why music videos needed to have alcohol and smoking. I'm like, aren't we just making something beautiful or aren't we doing art? Like I was so intrigued by like the production side of it. I love that the director could create these sets. I was never a part of that. I felt like I was always an outcast in that part of the industry. People probably thought I was odd and weird, but I didn't do any of that. Nothing. I was like, this is not what I want. I just want to make art. And so for me, it wasn't a lot of anxiety. I just felt like it definitely made me a little more introverted only because I didn't have that expression. I feel like people being extroverts by being party animals and doing things. And I was like, no, I'm not those things. So I just was more connected to like the production side.
What was your exposure to drugs growing up? Was it like a peripheral thing or like your immediate family members?
Yeah, two of my aunts are drug addicts and constantly. So I was always having to I was just used to them being on drugs and not being sober and being babysat by an aunt on drugs who's high and she's supposed to be watching us, and like just seeing certain spirits that just gave up. You know, my other aunt was on drugs and ended up getting shot, and I was like a block away from her. She ended up living, but she got shot in the head, like because of drug use. Like I seen very harsh, extreme things. And for me, it's just like I saw drugs when they weren't cute. I didn't see them in just party scenes. I saw them in crack houses. I saw my aunts in rehabs. I had to drop them off at rehabs, you know? So I just feel like everything about it, I just wanted nothing to do with it.
Would you see the people in the industry who were casually using, would you see that as, well, this is the first stage and I know where this leads to?
Oh, yeah. It scared me. Like, yeah, I've lost family members from it. I went through so much with just drugs and how it takes you from your family. So it's like, I think I saw the extreme side where people are addicted to the point where like they're on their last limb, you know, where they have to go into rehab. They're, you know, just, they don't even want to function without being sober in life. They're not present half the time. Like I'd seen all that where I didn't want that. Like I just felt like life, there was so much more. And even with the drugs and seeing the industry, I saw that no matter how you get into it, it leads to one road. And addiction is ugly.
Yeah. And speaking of which, what was the story that you would tell yourself about homeless people when you would see them? Because I'm sure you cross paths with them going in and out of the crack houses and things with your aunties.
Uh-huh. Well, for me, I felt like the difference was my aunt was a drug addict and she didn't die from drugs because we were always there to help her and love her. Drugs didn't kill her. She ended up getting murdered, but drugs didn't kill her. And for me, it was the difference between them and my aunt is she has people that love her that show up for her. So that was the hard part for me is when you're on that verge and no one's checking for you. No one cares if you die. You know, that was heartbreaking because everyone experiences things in life. Everyone that turns to drugs, a lot of times are trying to escape something. And the difference is when you're battling through those type of things, you can overcome it if you actually have someone to show up for you, someone to love you, someone to be there. And everyone doesn't have that. And that to me makes the difference. It's when someone loves you and shows up. Life can take you to like a lot of ugly turns. A lot of things can happen. A lot of pain can be faced and healed. But I think everyone needs support in life. And the difference is with all of that is my family still loved. They didn't give up on them. And that's the difference between living and dying of drugs. When you have that support, you know, from addiction.
And you knew that as a late teen from your own family's experience.
Oh my God, yes. I watched drugs destroy two of the most beautiful women I've ever met. Smartest women, broken women. Like my two aunts were my favorites. Their personality, everything about them, like they were empaths. They felt too much. They were creative. They were smart, but they couldn't beat it. And I think that was the thing too, is I never looked at anyone as though they were different. So for me with drugs, it was like, I'm no different than these beautiful, smart women where drugs have robbed them of such beautiful parts of their life. So I didn't feel like, I think a lot of times people get this Superman complex where they feel like, oh, I can control it. I can do this. And I'm like, no, it will take anyone you invite. Like anyone that invites it in their life, it will take. And so that to me, because I saw drugs, not in just a party scene, but in really rough, hard ways, I couldn't do it. I couldn't touch weed. I couldn't do anything because I watch it destroy people. Addiction, period. Even with alcohol, I don't drink. Like even I didn't want any form of addiction.
Right. You started a clothing line and you were in New York, and then eventually you made your way to Los Angeles. So talk about moving to Los Angeles and stumbling upon this 50 block tent city known as Skid Row.
Yes. So I wanted to, so the last time I would always come back and forth because a lot of the music videos I did were in LA. Like I would always have to come out here. There was always something that would bring me here, but then my heart would always go back to New York because it was like, yeah, it didn't feel like home to me. There was no home element. There was no family. There was nothing here that felt like home. The only thing that I felt like I could do was like the industry. And that was kind of like bittersweet. I liked creating, but I didn't like all the things that came with it. So when I decided to come to LA and say, you know what, I'm going to give LA a try, it was because you can manufacture here. I really wanted a US made brand, and New York is harder to have a US made brand. LA is one of the top manufacturing places in the US. And so I was like, okay, I can do this. Like that's what made me give it a chance, is I wanted to expand my brand. I wanted to do more. And I always had access to LA. I just chose New York over LA. So coming here, of course, tithing, these last 15 years, I've always tithed. That's been my thing. It doesn't matter what there isn't a city I haven't visited. I can't tell you where the homeless area is, because I always would do that. I always make it a point to go out and help people and find people to help and be good to. And LA, I had heard of Skid Row. I didn't understand the depth and level of it until I drove in it. And I just remember the first time I drove in it, I was crying. I was crying because all the times I'd been exposed to LA, I'd been exposed to its wealth. I've been exposed to it, from high profile people, from celebrities, from directors, from music videos. Like I had seen the parts of LA that people fall in love with, the access, self-made millionaires, artists that become full. Like I had seen the beauties of LA. I had cried because I had seen the ugly part of LA, that it hurt me that all this wealth, all these resources, and people are left to live that way. And it's not far, like I think about, I spent a lot of time in Beverly Hills and Westwood, the West Side. That's less than 10 miles away.
Right.
I was hurt because I'm like, wait, no one's helping? Wait, I have nowhere near the amount of money as the people I've worked with, and I'm doing more than them.
So the first day you experienced Skid Row, you drove down there, you parked, and you just kind of walked around, or what was your experience like?
Yeah, well, the first time I drove through and I just went on the blocks because I couldn't believe it was just block after block after block. I was like, wait, what? Like, because, you see a couple people who are homeless, but I'm like, wait a minute, I think the hardest part was the fact that it was so established. That's what threw me off. It wasn't temporary. That was an established space. This is a city that has been built, and everyone's comfortable with this condition because it has not changed. So that was what threw me off. And so at the time, I'm like, seeing that amount of people, I didn't have enough to tithe for everyone. Like in my head, I was always able to cover the people I knew, I was always able to help. That was over my head. That was so many people. My first thought was, I want to do more. I'm going to contact some nonprofits. Because for the last 15 years, well, no, it was 10 years at that time. For the last 10 years, I had never thought really I've done fundraisers for nonprofits, for like AIDS Foundation and education in Ethiopia and the abused children's fund. Like I've done a lot of community work prior to my tithing, but I never worked closely with the nonprofit. I would always be a part of some type of fundraiser. And so I was like, oh my God, like I know this community. I know how to reach them. I know how to speak to them. I know how to love on them. I need to hit up nonprofits because they have 10 times more than I have. Like I was just thinking like maybe I could be a drop in the ocean, like a nonprofit felt like it had so many more resources than just me as a single person. And so I reached out to nonprofits looking for places to volunteer because I just wanted to help. And I hated my experiences. I hated volunteering for nonprofits. I was so hurt by how they treated the people. Because you're talking about 10 years, I have gone to different cities, different countries, met people who are homeless and been able to reach them, love them, be kind to them. Like it was so weird to go into a space where you thought these nonprofits are doing so much great work. So they're doing so much for the people. And you realize their infrastructure, their blueprint keeps them from making an impact. Their very structure, blocks them. It's like they're writing grants to hand out a sandwich and I'm just pulling in my pocket and buying food for a sandwich. Like it just was a very different approach. And I'm like, why are there all these hoops to jump just to help our people? That's the problem. So I was just confused by that. That's what made me even start Lunch on Me, because I wanted to help people. I wanted to gather more people to help people. And I didn't want it to be the excuse of a blueprint to stop us from loving people.
So before we get to Lunch on Me, tell me a little bit more about your mother at this time, because I read that she's got sick or she passed or something like that. Was that around this time?
No. She passed 3 years ago now. She passed 3 years ago, Mother's Day. She passed away actually when I was filming our first
Okay.
video. She passed away 3 years ago.
So were you telling her and your other family that, hey, I'm on Skid Row now and I'm noticing this huge problem and I want to do something about it? Or is this something you kind of just do on your own and you talk about it Thanksgiving?
Yeah, the crazy part was I told my grandmother, and of all the stuff she did, that made her smile the most. Like my grandmother, that was the first, and I felt like I had accomplished so many things. That was the first time I saw her like, you get it, you got it, you understand. That made her and I didn't get it because Lunch on Me was nowhere near where it's at now. It was just me gathering people, asking people to help me hand out food. It wasn't a big deal. But my grandmother was so happy about that. I never, like, there was no, but you have to understand, my grandmother welcomed everyone in her home. This is the reason my aunts were able to be drug addicts and still come home for dinner. So she was the one, I had people that, of course, didn't understand it. But she's the only one that said what I was doing was so important.
Mm-hmm. So the first time you decided to take action at Skid Row, you called people in Los Angeles who you knew. And what was that day like?
Well, the first event I did, because I was only around people in entertainment. So my first event was called Models Being Role Models. Mm-hmm. And so I literally my first event, it was nothing but models and photographers because I only knew industry people. I didn't really know anyone in LA outside of industry people. So it was literally I had probably 120 people come and probably 50 of them, 60 of them were models. Mm-hmm. But it was a situation where I didn't think that many people would come. So in my head, I didn't really know what I was doing on that scale because I had no background in the nonprofit world. But I was people were calling me. I had only invited about 20 friends that I knew that were all in the industry that I was like, okay, I know they'll come out. And everyone was calling me, asking specific questions. And I realized I didn't really have the answer because I just wanted to help people. I just wanted to show up and help people. So they were like, well, how much food are we going to do? And I'm like, let's feed 500. I was just throwing out numbers. I'm like, okay, let's just go for it. So I really didn't know. So I'm like, okay, let's feed 500 people. They were like, okay, how many people do you think you'll need? And they were like, well, what do you want us to bring? I'm like, I asked everyone the same thing. I was like, I'll make shirts. Can you guys just buy your shirts? So we're all in the same uniform. Basically, there was no profit on them. I was just charging the price of the shirt. Can you guys and then everyone bring something. So basically I had decided on vegan pizza, cold pressed juices, and 2 days before it kind of divinely aligned because I'm like, where am I going to get 500 cold pressed juices from, 2 days before I'm walking into a Whole Foods to get my own food and Suja, the juice company, is there. Handing out samples. And I was just I literally walked up to them. I'm like, hey, have you guys ever done anything for the homeless? And they're like, no, not really. I was like, I'm doing an event in 2 days. Do you think maybe you guys can give us some of your juices? Because it's they were giving it away for free in Whole Foods. So I'm like, obviously you don't have a problem giving away free product. And I didn't really know anything about, like I said, sponsorships and all that. So she was like, you want to give it to the homeless? She's like, well, how many people are you feeding? I'm like, 500 is our number. She's like, no problem. 48 hours later, Sue just shows up with 500 cold pressed juices. And then people were showing up and I was asking everyone to just bring healthy snacks, whatever that was. I didn't really care. Then I had found this vegan pizza company. I called them and was like, hey, I need to feed 500 people, but I don't have enough money to feed 500 people. So I was like, can you guys help me? And like, I literally started calling places. I didn't care. I was just like, we want to do this. We don't really have the funds to do this. Can you give it to me at cost? And the pizza guys gave it to me at cost.
Did you get that idea to call them up after the Suja situation? Were you like, oh my God, I can get people to just donate this stuff?
No, I just felt like closed mouths don't get fed. I got to ask whoever I can ask. It was just one of those situations. I was honest. I'm like, this is what I'm working with. What can we do with this?
But you were prepared to pay for it yourself.
Yeah, I did pay for it myself. At the time, I didn't ask people for money. I didn't ask anyone for anything because I didn't care.
Where were you getting the money from?
It was my savings.
So it wasn't even money that you were generating through income. It was just money you'd saved up.
Yeah. And I felt like at the end of the day, like I would never go broke from helping. Like I always felt like there was this abundance. Like I never had the scarcity complex. I have been dirt poor. I had said no to jobs in the industry that were against my moral compass and had to sleep in my car for a month. I never would sell my soul and my morale for money ever in my life. And I never felt like money. I never felt that scarcity complex because every time I was broke, I survived. The times that my accounts were negative, I survived. So I never had this feeling of money to hold on to it.
So this is an important point. What financial position were you in at the time? I know you had savings, but were you making a good salary?
No. I was just building my brand. I had put all my savings into coming to LA. So I just remember, this is what's crazy. Right after that happened, I had less than $1,500 in my account and I gave away $1,000.
On that day, on that first day of feeding the homeless?
No, it was maybe like a week later. That's a whole nother story. But a week later, I took $1,000 out of my $1,500. It was probably 14 something, like $1,490. And I took $1,000 out and put $100 in 10 envelopes and gave them away.
To who?
To 10 people who were on Skid Row.
Wow. So you had $1,500 to your name. You took out $1,000.
Mm-hmm.
And you gave it all out to 10 people.
Yeah.
On Skid
And the
Row.
craziest part was because it came to me in my meditation. I heard it clearly. But when I first heard it, I was like, maybe I'm hearing this wrong. Because in my head, I kept hearing, no, I'm serious. Because I'm like, there's no way.
Like, okay, you mean take $10 out and give $1?
Exactly. That's how I felt. I'm like, $100, $10 for 10 people. In my head, I thought I wasn't grounded enough because I was like, you clearly are not hearing stuff. I heard it clearly 3 times. This is what's so crazy. I'll never forget this day because this is what made me understand the power of being detached from money and being attached to giving. I heard it 3 times. Then I was like, damn it. I remember cussing after my meditation because I knew that's what I heard. And it was like the moment you're accountable. And I was like, oh no. So long story short, I end up doing it. And I'm like thinking like, oh Lord, when it like, what this is, now I probably have $400 something in my account in my name. Like that's it. And so long story short, I gave it to 10 different people. It's crazy because fast forwarding now, 5 years later, I know all those people from Skid Row and I have to tell you all their stories because half of them are all in apartments now. And that money had to do with their turning point, but that's a whole nother thing. This was just the obedience I heard from being so connected to a higher source, higher power, and moving from the space of God love. That's what I believe because the lesson that happened, this is what's so crazy. That happened to me. I gave the last envelope away. I got in my car. As soon as I got in my car, I got a call to make $3,000 for half a day for like 6 hours of work. But it happened as soon as I turned my car on and I just started crying because the first thing I heard was when you hand out, God will fill up your cup before you even have a chance to grab it.
Oh my God. So wait a minute.
I know that's like the craziest. I've never even really shared that story yet with people.
Tell me about your meditation practice. Just to get a little snapshot of what's actually happening. How often are you doing it? Where, tell me how it works.
So I meditate. So during that time, it was a little different.
During that time, yeah.
Yeah, my practice has changed a lot from 5 years ago. During that time, I would start in the morning. I would turn everything off. And a lot of times I would open up my Bible. Now it's different. I don't have to open up the Bible to do it. Before, I would open up the Bible. I would look for like a script, like whatever my hand landed on. And then I would meditate on that scripture to ask for understanding, whatever that meant, because I didn't send things I didn't really understand. At the time, I was incorporating the Bible. In that moment, it was every time I hear words, like when I sit in stillness, nothing around, no phone, anything. I've always, since my meditation started when I was homeless and slept in my car. That's when I really believe that was God isolating me to hear clearly. That's a whole nother thing. But that's kind of where my practices started. Was I was sleeping in my car. And that was something I decided to do because certain things in the industry I was not willing to do. And I walked away from it. But I always decided from staying in my car, never to move until I heard from God. And so I sit and meditation would change every day. It would never be like, oh, I'm doing this for an hour. I would sit until I heard from God. I always would wait till I heard a message, whatever that was. Some days it was be the bigger person. And, and that meditation, that 24 hours, whatever message I heard, I carried that out within those 24 hours. Sometimes it's a person will come up, forgive them. I've got 24 hours to call them and forgive them. Like I always listen to God and that's how every single day, God tells me what to do in the morning every single day. That's my steps have been ordered for a very long time. And that day was these envelopes. And I was like, God's getting specific. And that's how I felt. I'm like, this is getting wild. Because it was going from like, to me, it seemed a lot more general, forgive, let go. Like I would hear things like that to take out $1,000. This is going to 10 people. Then I literally, in my meditation, I would ask God back, like, who do I give it to? And I would hear, God said, you'll know. And so I did it. That's how I've moved. And I've never had so much peace in my life ever since I've moved in that way. And so in the beginning, it was always don't move till you hear from God. Now it's so clear. I hear messages from God throughout the entire day.
Mm. You've turned up the still small voice. It's now loud.
It's so loud. So before it was, I have to sit here and I have to wait. I have to figure out where it's coming, when it's coming. And I think a lot of that's when you get into that space of peace, like that shift inside of you, that where you become harmony. And so what I learned is as I was listening to that still voice, I was being tested. Would the voice be louder than the world? And that was the thing. $1,000, ooh, 1,500, whew. That was, to me, I felt like that was the voice calling my bluff. Am I really there? Like, have I really arrived? And the things I want in life, what would I be willing to give up?
So speaking of which, was it true that you were out there 6 days a week for a year?
Yeah.
On Skid Row?
Every single day. Yeah. Almost 2 years. Now we're at 7 days this year because of COVID and everything. But yeah, I was there personally, it changed. Basically the reason I left was because when my mother got sick, I was in the hospital for 4 months. So within that time, I started changing my program around where other people could be more involved because I was down there for 6 days, like every day. That was me, like religiously. I would never let anyone do it without me being there helping. When my mom got sick, I had to start letting up on the trust.
Wait, so it started with monthly, right? After that first feeding, and then you went to daily?
Yeah. So what happened was, I would say the first year, a little less than the first year, we were doing an event once a month. Basically, after I did the first one, I didn't expect over 120 people to show up. I invited 25 people. Everyone brought people. Everyone supported. But what was crazy is 500 people in a day was the most I've ever fed. And so in my head, I thought I was accomplished. And then everyone was like, when's the next one? And that was kind of like, oh my God, there has to be a next one. Like, you don't think about it because it's like you've gone from feeding 1 or 2 people or a couple to 500 a day. And you're like, what do you mean the next one? But then in that moment, it reminded me the same people are going to be hungry tomorrow. So to never be so caught up on what I've done today, because tomorrow it changes. Until we alleviate the problem, there's always going to be work to be done. And so at the time, I started making it monthly because having Suja sponsor the drinks and then me buying the pizza and doing that, I'm like, maybe I can get other companies to help. So that kind of gave me an idea, like, if I have a month to prepare for a party, because at that time it was like we just threw it on the streets. But it was a party on the block. Like, we made an unofficial block party by just having tables out, you know? Then I was like, so many people showed up. You're talking about over 120 volunteers. We fed 500 people. I was like, we need a space for this, because no one really wanted to leave. Everyone wanted to be there. And I realized I couldn't just give them food and go. They wanted to mingle. They wanted to know about us. They wanted to build a relationship. So I started really thinking of like, oh, I got to ask some nonprofits if I can use their space. You know, what can I do? So I just started thinking about that. And then I started reaching out to companies, getting a lot of no's, because you're talking about 5 years ago, I was asking for vegan food. Vegan wasn't even a word. I was just asking. I was literally like, do you guys have any fruits and vegetables to donate?
Well, that was my next question is, what were you doing differently? Because I'm sure there are a ton of people organizations that, you know, go out there and feed homeless people on Skid Row. What were you doing? What were you bringing to the table? No pun intended. That was different.
Yeah. So, well, so I've been plant-based since I was 19 years old. I'm 32 now. So it wasn't even called plant-based. I went raw. Like, that's what it was called during the time. I was doing like raw food, nothing cooked. Like, I went really like purist when it came to food. And this is, again, something I heard in my meditation. So no one understood. Just 5-6 years ago, there wasn't these fake meats. Like, it was just fruits and vegetables. So when I was getting like the vegan pizzas and things like that, I had already been doing this for so I was 19 years old. So in my mind, I didn't realize I was being different, but everything about what I did had always been different. So I didn't think anything of it because I didn't put an emphasis, oh, we're giving better food. It was just like, I'm looking for foods that I eat. I didn't have the idea that people are lower than us, so I should give them less. The idea was I want to share. So I eat at Whole Foods. I'm going to ask Whole Foods to help. I get my vitamins from Sprouts. I'm going to ask Sprouts to help. So our partners and the people I went to were always the same food I ate. Because I never understood this idea of like, you'll go have like this fancy dinner and then do a canned food drive. You won't eat the food that you're donating.
How did the vegan food go over on Skid Row?
Well, the thing is, vegan wasn't a thing for anybody anywhere. So outside of Skid Row, everyone thought I was weird. So everyone thought I was. So when it first happened, they used to call us the lettuce girls. They'd be like, she's trying to feed us like we're rabbits. That's what they used to joke and say. They'd always be like, oh, she's giving us rabbit food. And then which I think it created this really cool space because it was like this resistance, but I was not letting up. I was like, well, we give out fruits and vegetables. And if you want some, have some. I remember one day, like, it was so much trial and error. Like, our first monthly sponsor was Juice Served Here. And that's when we started hitting like 10,000 meals a month because of companies like that. But long story short, I remember one day they gave me like probably 5,000 or 6,000 of their lemon maple cayenne pepper drinks. And I didn't think anything of it because I give them out Skid Row. They were like, you trying to kill us.
Right. You had them all on the master cleanse.
So everyone, and they already trusted me. They were like, she's going to kill us. And I was like, no. So I had all these moments where I was going through this health journey and bringing an entire community along with me. But the coolest thing ever that happened was doing those things and then people coming back to me, war vets. Like, you know, you talking about like steak and potato guys. They still eat the same way as they ate in war, you know? And they're like, baby, that food really made me feel better. Like them having these moments of that made me feel so much better that they never had that before. Or no one ever brought me this kind of, like, it was so foreign. They were interested about it because it was so different than everyone else. They were like, she's bringing us black lemonade. Like, they're like so confused. Like, what? They would be like teasing me, like,
The
what do you have
charcoal.
now?
Yeah.
Yes. And then I'm having to explain to them, I'm sorry, I don't have any like iceberg lettuce, but you've got arugula today. Be prepared. It tastes like pepper. Like, I had to find ways to describe to them what they were about to go through. And so it got to the point when I started working with Health Aid and I'm bringing kombucha. My selling point was if tea and beer had a baby. And that was because I was describing their experiences so they could understand what they were about to take. Because, you know, you gave them some great stuff. You gave them some stuff. I tell them, this tastes good. This is for health. Like, and now it's completely different. They love it. They love, to the point where so many people from Skid Row will not eat from anyone other than us because they
They're
started
picky.
now they're picky, and but they started to like collect their own information. And like, why when I eat their food, I feel sick? They started seeing it for themselves. I never had to say it. They started to see the health benefits just through their own experience. Or people who were drug addicts, being able to give them coconut water, hydrate them, cleanse them. Like, we've been helping on that level.
It's ironic that the LA homeless people are snobs when it comes to the type of food that they
Because they
prefer.
have a right to be, right?
No,
because,
I think it's great. I think it's awesome.
But that's what happens when you love people. When you love them, you empower them to feel like they deserve more and they don't need table scraps. To me, when someone feels like I can take anything, you haven't even loved them well enough for them to stand up tall and ask for something that they demand. So that is just showing that we love them well.
You had a very interesting mission statement, which was creating sacred spaces where people can actually be seen, right?
100%.
And so that's what this was all about. It was about feeding people food that allowed them to be seen. And then ultimately you went on to create an actual physical space that allowed people to feel.
It was humanizing people.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like as a woman of color, I know what it's like not to be viewed as human. I've been there. I haven't had it where it's always been that easy, where I haven't had to deal with what it's like to be othered. I've been othered in so many spaces. I connect to them because I get it. I understand what it's like, whether you're homeless or you're a person of color navigating in a white space. You know what other feels like, whether you're mixed in a space that's not normal. Like, I've been othered, so it was so important to me that we see each other, we respect each other, we love each other, and it was important that we pour dignity into people, because that's what I'm seeing a lot of. They're stripped of their dignity, and it's by their daily treatment. It validates their worth. That's anybody.
Talk about the concept of suffering well, which is another thing that you said you learned on Skid Row.
Yeah, I think that my respect and regard for people who suffer well, being in so many privileged spaces, you realize that people don't suffer well because the world is at their feet. You have people who every day are disappointed, who are hurt, who are mistreated, and they wake up and smile. They find something to be happy about. They live in devastating conditions, and yet they can wake up and turn on music and be happy enough just to dance in the street. Like, the joy that they have. You don't hear about suicide on Skid Row. You hear about it in Beverly Hills. People are hanging themselves from mansions, not from poor areas. And that's the truth. So I have so much admiration for people who suffer well, because those are people who have faced war and so many difficulties and are still showing up and contributing to the world in a positive way. These are people that have every right to burn the city down and don't. And that's the truth. That is suffering well. That this city is still standing. There's 58,000 people living in poverty because resources have been taken from them.
Can you talk about the story of Kevin, I met him when I met you for the first time when you were giving that talk?
Little Kevin. Oh my God. I see him all the time. He's at the shop all the time. Kevin it's beautiful because it is a success story for us. And I say that because he was my turning point to realize my radical love meant something. And I think that's why, like, when I see him, I think of that. I think of the fact that when I was on Skid Row 6 nights a week at 2, 4 in the morning, handing out food, you don't always know why you're doing what you do when you're called. You don't really know what it means, if it'll ever mean something to someone, if you're being crazy. Like you don't know. There's no point of reference. And to see Kevin, who was living on Skid Row, who was homeless, who disappeared for a while. And I just kept thinking about this guy who didn't speak much. And now, I mean, I can't get him to be quiet. You know, someone that I've like empowered in a way by being loving. And I think it was one of those situations. We didn't go to Skid Row to have a complex of saviors, right? Like I didn't go there with the idea that I would save people or change them. I went there with the idea that I had love to give and I was willing to give it. And to see the love that you're willing to give transmute into healing and empowerment for someone to the point where he no longer lives on Skid Row. He's working, he has a place to stay, and he comes to our shop and buys stuff. And now he feeds people on Skid Row. Every Thanksgiving, he's now doing a feeding for people in the community. I've watched a complete 360. I watched what love can do. I watched when little things aren't little. They're not small. I don't think we always realize, but defining moments are glimpses. They're small things. And that's what I realized with him. He changed my ideas to being beyond radical, but to knowing they could shift the world if I could only lead with my heart. And that was my defining moment because he got off Skid Row. You know, we've had people be sober. Like the fact that like our program wasn't built off, I'm going to get you off the streets. I'm going to stop you from doing drugs. It was built off, I'm going to give you the love you deserve. I'm going to give you love without reason. And let that birth whatever it birthed, because for every person, it's something different.
Wow, that's such a really, really important point to make. Instead of going there looking to save people from whatever their affliction may be in your eyes, just love them and let them feel seen and heard, and then something will be born from that. So you got another interesting cognition in your meditation.
Oh my God, so many.
that had to do with going all in full time on the Skid Row experience. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was another crazy moment I had. Oh gosh. So, like I was saying before, my downloads, I call them like my spiritual downloads, my guidances. I got a download right after my mother passed away. That was probably one of the first times I felt shattered. I feel like I've always been resilient. I've always jumped back up. But in my meditation, I heard her say, go pitch a tent and sit for 7 days. And
after she
passed.
I
knew a Skid Row. This was after she passed. It was like one of the first times I heard her voice. I've always heard like spirits and things like that. Like I've always been a medium in that way. Like I've always heard spirits. I can't even like deny that. Like I've always been able to hear other things, other messages. But it was the first time I had heard her voice. It was her energy, her resonance. And I'm just like, in my head, I thought I was so broken that I was like, maybe I can go serve more. In my mind, it was like every time I've been hurt, for me, I've been able to transmute my pain through service and by giving more, helping more, showing up. I think it keeps you from being a victim and you become more empowered. And that's just my approach to giving. Everyone has a different reason as to why they do. But in that moment, I thought I was there to help heal other people. But I really, and that's when I decided to stay on Skid Row. I thought I was staying there for 7 days. It ended up being a 7 in numerology, but it was actually 43 days. Okay. And that was the 7 I had seen. And I stayed on Skid Row. And the last day was the craziest feeling in the world because I felt the pain of my mom completely like lift off me. It was the weirdest. It was like the weirdest, like supernatural experience I've ever had because I thought I was there to heal people and I was really there to be healed.
Wow. And when you were preparing for that, was the idea to go down there with no money and just kind of have the whole experience that they were having, or did you go to Patagonia and get like some tents and whatnot?
No. No, it was, I went there with no money. The goal was to understand the daily life, because I have been homeless, but I always say that like what made my homelessness softer is I had a car to sleep in. So I had a car to sleep in. I got a membership at a gym, and I would go shower there, and I would eat food at grocery stores. It's not really stealing because you ate it there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I would do. And so I always call my homelessness, it was like 5-star homelessness. Like I felt like I still had resources. Like I was able to afford a $30 a month membership, right? So I would hustle, always had that. And like being in that space of like sleeping in my car, it's different than being on Skid Row. There's levels to poverty. There's levels to homelessness. And so I felt a very small fraction of it, because I always was able to get myself out of whatever I had gotten myself into. But this was like, Skid Row. This was, it doesn't get any deeper than that. But it's like, how can you help someone fully if you don't understand it? And I learned, oh my God, my eyes just understanding from an emotional standpoint of how much resilience you have to have, how strong of a spirit. I learned like the real prophets and gurus are on Skid Row. Those are the real spiritual leaders that should be having voices, because they're able to transmute things I've never even experienced.
What were some of the experiences you had in terms of getting set up and just the day-to-day of living down on Skid Row? I heard you tell a story about trying to buy tarps, and I would love to hear more about that as well.
Yeah, so so in my mind, because you don't need that much money to live like bare minimum, right? Like in my head, like it's so crazy. LA never rains. So when I went down there, I didn't think I would encounter any type of rain. And of course I did, which I don't know. It was like a sick joke. I literally, one day, it's just completely gray outside, and they're like, oh, it's going to rain. And I'm like, wait, what? And they're like, yeah, I'm like, well, what do you guys use for rain? They're like, you're going to have to get tarps. And they're like, you need 2 tarps for your tent, because my tent was small, and they're about $12 each. And so in my mind, I'm like, oh, $24, I can come up with that. I can panhandle to get that. Like in my head, it was like, I can ask people for $24. And so I went to 7th and Figueroa, where there's like a huge like little outdoor mall strip in downtown. It's the financial area. I went there during a busy time because I was like, you know what? There's going to be hundreds of people walking by constantly. I'm about to ask people for money. And so I said, okay, I got to do this, got to try it out. Even though that's something that also makes me uncomfortable, the idea of asking for something. But it's like, I was at least telling people what I was getting. And there's a Target right there where the tarps are. So I was literally asking people, saying like, you know, I'm trying to raise $24 because I have to buy 2 tarps for my tent. I'm currently living on Skid Row and I need help getting my tarps for the rain. I had seen over 600 people that day. And everyone said no to me. Everyone. Like to the point where I don't sit in like fury often and long because I don't like that energy. I was furious that day. I was so angry by the level of resilience to help. No one wanted to help me. Like the energy that went into the no's and the not help could have easily solved my problem. And I was crying. Like I sat down because I was angry to tears. Because I'm like, I'm explaining my story. You can tell I'm not a drug addict. Like everyone has an excuse as to why they don't help. How do you see 600 people and no one give you $1? I was asking everyone for $1. I didn't even ask them for the whole thing. And I explained to them what people were disregarding me. People were cutting me off before I could even ask for help. And so I sat down. Mind you, I had a little change bucket that said love without reason on it. So in my head, it was just like, what? I sit down and it's literally like a movie. I sit down and I'm crying because I'm like telling myself like, I need to get, and I'm crying again out of anger. This is like the anger tears of like, I can't believe we are this far behind in our love. And then I hear change drop into my little box that says love without reason. And I go to look up because when I tell you when this change hit, it's restored. It was like I got angry and it was like the moment I'm like, I get to forgive. You know what I mean? It was like one of those like I wasn't wrong. I was wrong. People are loving. I turn and it's a homeless man. I bursted out. I mean, like I can barely talk about it now without crying. I bursted out into like tears. Like I was crying so hard I couldn't even move. Cause he was like limping away. Like he was just like, and so my friend Nemo, which was like far away, runs to the man. Cause I can't even move. I'm like crying. Cause I'm like, I can't believe it. Of course someone homeless is the one that's loving. And so like, I'm crying cause I'm like, can't get it together. I'm stuck. He runs to him to grab him and tells him like, no, like this is kind of like a social experiment, you know, like I can't take this money from this man. And so like, Nima's asking him because I'm like in a space where I can't even talk. I'm like crying so hard. And Nima says like, why did you give her money? And he looks at me because I'm crying. I can't even explain to him what's happening because I'm so emotional in tears. And he's like rubbing my back and he's like, because I've been there before. And like, he just knew what it was like to like ask everyone for help and no one help him. So I was messed up. I was like super emotional. Every time I think about that day, I just like, I cry because he helped me. Like he gave me money and he opened, like we gave him his money back and he opened his wallet and he didn't have anything. You know what I mean? It was like, I was messed up. Like I was messed up.
He literally gave you his last money.
And didn't think anything of it. That's what I'm telling you. It's like what makes it so like heart-wrenching is like, this man is so free. It's a level of freedom that most of the world does not have. And he was just like, it's okay. And it was just like, and it was normal to him. It was normal to be in a space that's like people being good to each other is dependent on our survival, helping each other. Even if you don't have much, it's like, there's no excuse as to why you don't give. If you don't give, it's a you problem. It has nothing to do with what the resources you have. That resistance is within your own heart. That resistance is you. It's nothing other than that. Everything that we say we have and don't have is an excuse. And that completely opened my eyes to life, to abundance and scarcity, and how deeply rooted in our hearts and how our hearts are wired. And that was one of the hardest. And it takes a lot because when you go from those spaces and then you go into privileged spaces, people have so much and they won't give you a dime.
And they'll call the police on you.
They won't, oh my God. And so it's hard when you see someone, and even when you think about it, it's not someone that's robbing you. And we can't even talk about how this world has been robbed of so many things from so many people. These aren't even people robbing you. They're just asking for some help. They're so humble that they have put themselves in the lowest position possible to be asking for help, and they're still denied it. That's why people should be grateful that the city hasn't burned down from the amount of pain that they've caused.
What did you find? I read a statistic that said that people who go through the foster care system, I think it was through researching your story, 40% of them or something like that, they end up incarcerated or end up homeless. If you had to categorize the people that lived on Skid Row, like what background would you say that they predominantly come from?
When I think of number one, I think of foster care because so many people don't have anyone to call in family because they were given up at birth. So after 18, they just get released and then they're just on homeless. Oh yeah, on average, over 50% of kids that turn 18 become homeless within 6 months. They have nowhere to go. Nowhere to go. Like where do you go? To your high school friend's parents' house? Like where do you go? You're a child. You just graduated high school. Only 3% of foster kids go to college. Because that's not a level of intelligence, that's a level of neglect. And so not to say that college is the answer. I didn't go to college and came out just fine. But it's just showing the levels of I had the opportunity to. They aren't given the opportunity. So foster care, 100%, because the foster care system needs to start over. Literally, like the foundation of this country needs to start over. The foster care system has to start from scratch. I would be okay if they threw everything away and said, we're going to start tomorrow from scratch. We don't even know what we're doing. Them not knowing what they're doing will be more positive than what they've done. Because their numbers are too low to even respect the system. So that's number one. A huge thing that we see a lot is military. Vets.
PTSD.
Oh my God. My favorite guy. I was with him a couple of days ago. His name is Walter. He was in Vietnam. And someone like him, where he survived the war, a lot of his friends didn't make it. They had him in a rehab in Chicago. And like he told me, he went to Skid Row because they kept him in a rehab and just kept drugging him up. And he was like, I'm hurt. I went through things, but I don't want to die like this. And he literally came to Skid Row because he was like, I'd rather be on Skid Row than drugged up. Because he was like, they're going to kill me in this place. Because basically everyone's not, the system doesn't teach you to work through your problems. They teach you to medicate them. That's the infrastructure of the system. That's just what it is. And that's fine. Our society is addicted to a lot of things because of it. But there's also people that they want to work through their problems and they just want support. And you've got people who, can you imagine trying to work through your problems because they're medicated? Your new problem is fighting your addiction and it's not even addressing the actual root issue. So it's layering problems on top of each other. And so you have the biggest thing I notice within everyone in every walk of life is unaddressed trauma. A lot of the people that are there are in such a deep hole of trauma that's been unaddressed, and then it's a chain reaction. It's been layered on top of each other, and it's all this pain and people being unloved. All of it is unaddressed trauma, and when you're not loved well,
right? Not being seen.
Mm-hmm.
So then you created a documentary from your 43 days on Skid Row. What's the status on that?
We shoot this Sunday. In 2 weeks, we go into post-production. So we cut, a sizzle reel, but now we're going into post-production because we've also been filming the effects that COVID has had on the homeless community.
Right. Beautiful.
So now the world is different. Just in this little bit of time, the world has turned upside down.
Right. And you have a bodega. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes. For anyone that doesn't know what a bodega is, it's anyone that's Afro-Latino that owns a market. For us, usually it's like predominantly Puerto Rican or Dominican, but it's our bodegas are one of our safe spaces and communities. The thing is, in bodegas, especially in New York or in Puerto Rico, everyone knows you in the community. It's your corner store that's not necessarily affiliated with a big market, It's where you can get all your essentials, all your needs, but then the people in the community. It's the hub that people go to. And I wanted to create that in LA. LA doesn't really have that bodega community. And I wanted to introduce it because I felt like it was so important. And I think that now what we're going through in these last couple of weeks, more than ever, people are realizing the importance of community unity. And so I wanted to create a space where people in the neighborhood, specifically food deserts that need healthy food and access, could have access to healthy food without it going against the price point of the community. Because the biggest issue is Whole Foods is a wonderful market, but a huge percentage of America can't afford it. So it doesn't make it accessible. It makes it commercialized.
Is this a part of the Lunch on Me nonprofit?
Yes. So basically, we've reached within our 5 years, we distribute 10,000 free plant-based organic meals a month. We wanted to now create markets that gave everyone access and became more zero waste. I like to call our markets the Goodwill of organic. And so we do a lot of partnerships, a lot of repurposing of food. We work with farmers and we get a hold of a lot of food that would go to landfills that are completely good. We just produce so much and we don't have a strong system for repurposing in America. And so I wanted to focus on all that.
It's called LaRayya's Bodega, right?
Yes, LaRayya's Bodega. The concept of that was it is different than traditional bodegas because it is plant-based, it is vegan. It's kind of like if LA and New York met. Is kind of what it would look like. And then, but with elements of Lunch on Me, Love Without Reason, which was you come into our bodega, you will always see street family there because it's also a hub where anyone who's homeless can come get a free meal. So they drop in all day, just grabbing a meal and going. But it was a place where it was like everyone's invited.
Yeah, I've been there and I think it's wonderful. I mean, it's I lived in New York before and there's definitely bodegas there, but it's a more eclectic experience than a traditional New York bodega. And I just love the way that the retail part is curated. You got really beautiful things. And the friend that I was with, she bought a bunch of plants when she was in there. So there's not a lot of bodegas that sell beautiful succulents.
Yeah.
and Make America Love Again hats and all of these kinds of things. And wonderful coconut water with little bits of coconut in it. I mean, it was really, really amazing. So I think that was a job well done. And if anybody listening to this is planning a trip to Los Angeles and things are open back up, you definitely want to put that on your to-do list to make a trip downtown to LaRayya's Bodega because it's such a special, I think it's a very special LA type of experience. And I mean that in a good way.
Yeah.
And that you can go somewhere where it doesn't look like you're going to find that little oasis and you end up stumbling upon this really beautiful place where you'll probably end up spending a good hour just hanging out and watch people watching and having some wonderful food.
Yes, we're so excited, like what we've been able to do with the bodega. And our next venture is we're in the process of getting a drink truck. So we're going to have the bodega on wheels and it's going to be stationed in Long Beach.
Amazing.
So hopefully we'll be able to bring that to just different communities where everyone gets a chance to have holistic healing, healthy food, and then the proceeds from our store go into our programs. From sponsoring people to helping with resumes to getting jobs for people. Like we do a lot of stuff within the community and the bodega was our brick and mortar that was to help fund it because we're not government funded and we don't receive grants. We just work directly with our community, raise our capital ourselves and work with just like private donors that want to help monthly, community-based people who just want to see the community have better from people-based organizations and not government structures.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's the best way if someone has a food company or if they just want to be involved, what's the best way for someone to do that?
Oh, they can email us at hi@lunchonme.org. We're always looking to partner with community people, with independent owners that have access to food and holistic healing. We're all about everyone coming together. It's a potluck. Our whole concept is a potluck. If we all bring something to the table, we all have a feast. So there isn't anything too big or small.
What do you need help with the documentary?
The documentary, I'm currently going into post. If anyone does sound and wants to come out in the next 2-3 weeks, because I'm just filming interviews and things like that. Even just studio recording. That's really all I need help with in that part because majority of it is shot. I'm just getting more of like the interview stuff now. But if anyone has that or a studio that I can film.
Is it financed? I know post-production can be kind of expensive.
I'm paying for everything myself.
Okay.
So we have a fundraiser for it on our CrowdRise for anyone that wants to help because everything's just kind of come out of my pocket.
Okay. Beautiful.
So yeah, if anyone wants to help, we would never deny help because it's a lot of work for us.
I would love to just continue talking for another hour and hear all about the details of living on Skid Row, but I like to also leave the listener wanting more. And I think this is enough to give them, to whet their appetites so that they can come in and engage with you guys in whichever ways can be helpful for everyone. But I just wanted to say, again, thank you for taking time to have this dialogue with me. And I like to finish these conversations by offering up some of my own reflections from hearing the story and tying things back to childhood. So remembering that you were talking about painting and drawing, and what you were doing, maybe without even realizing it, was making things better than what they were. And I've seen this in so many stories where the intent behind why someone did what they did when they were young, it ended up manifesting into their purpose later on in life. And I think yours is probably one of the clearer examples of that, where when you go anywhere, and especially going to Skid Row and to whatever homeless areas and whatever cities you happen to be in, you don't see homeless people. You see angels, and you see people who have the potential to be anything they want to be if their environment is nurtured, if they feel seen, and if they feel heard. And it seems like that has been with you for your entire life. And thank God you were blessed with the angels of your grandmother and your drug addicted aunts to help to familiarize you with those kinds of environments, so that you would not be intimidated when you saw that again later in life in those homeless areas. And your friend Jamila, who's been with you in your nonprofit efforts, and of course your sweet mother, who still communicates with you through your meditations and tells you what to do and how to help.
Yes.
And so I just want to acknowledge you for your heroism, for your courage, for your bravery, for your willingness to keep doing what you know you're here to do. I did have one question for you, actually, that I would like to ask, because it's come up so much, not just in this interview, but also in my research. What do you think happens when someone passes? I
think our energy travels and goes where it wants to go. I think it evolves, and it I feel like it's a doorway. You know, in Louisiana, they have a term called they're visiting the thin places. And I think that, I don't know if it's far from us. It feels like it's just a frequency, you know, that we might change and exist in. But it feels like maybe we go somewhere and our dreams are our life, and vice versa. So maybe they're in a dream state, and then when they contact us, that is their dream, you know, but it feels very connected. It doesn't feel like we go far.
Because I have a theory that what you believe happens when you die very much informs how you live your life. And it seems as though you're definitely not here to make money. You're in the direct sense of that phrase. You're here to give and to serve, and really to help people in whatever ways you can. And I think there's a inherent understanding that when you do that, everything will come that you need. And when this whole life known as LaRayia Gaston, you know, comes to its final conclusion, and you transition into that next stage, I think that you recognize that is the wealth that we are here to accumulate. And so yes. just want to acknowledge that as well.
Oh,
and
love that.
Thank you for that example. Thanks for modeling that for all of us who listen to this episode.
Thank you so much for listening to my interview with LaRayia Gaston. I certainly left the conversation feeling inspired, and I hope you did too. You can find links to everything that LaRayia and I talked about in the show notes below, and all of the ways to become a part of her mission. Also, make sure you're subscribed to At the End of the Tunnel so you don't miss any of these incredible conversations. And don't forget to rate and review the podcast if you haven't already, because it really does help more people discover these stories. Oh, and did you know that I send out a daily dose of inspiration each morning? Yeah, I've been doing that for years now. I send out a short story or a musing or an anecdote that I find personally inspiring, and it's just a little dose of inspiration to help you start your day. So if that sounds like something you'd be into, I encourage you to sign up for my daily dose of inspiration email at lightwatkins.com. Of course, it's free, and I think you'll thoroughly enjoy it. Thanks again for taking the time to listen and share and post about this episode. It truly means a lot to me, and I'll see you back here in a week for the next installment of At the End of the Tunnel.